Welcome to Skytech-Lens. On August 1, 2025, the Trump administration reignited its trade war, this time with a sweeping expansion of tariffs targeting over 70 countries. President Trump's message was clear: protect American industries, punish unfair trading partners, and bring manufacturing jobs back home. Canada, a close ally, was hit hardest. A 35% tariff slapped on key goods like steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, and auto parts. The goal: make Canadian imports prohibitively expensive, forcing American companies to buy domestic and, in theory, spark a blue-collar jobs boom. But this aggressive move ignored the deep integration of North American supply chains. Instead of a manufacturing renaissance, the tariffs triggered economic pain, starting not in Ottawa but in the U.S. itself. The opening salvo had been fired, but the fallout would be swift and unexpected. The tariffs' first victims weren't Canadian businesses, they were American manufacturers and workers. U.S. companies, especially in autos and construction, rely on Canadian materials. The sudden 35% tax sent costs soaring and business plans into chaos. General Motors reported a $1.1 billion loss, Ford, $800 million. Stanley Black & Decker projected $800 million in annual tariff costs. Even Apple faced $1.1 billion in new expenses. These losses translated directly into layoffs. Within 4 months, the U.S. manufacturing sector shed up to 40,000 jobs. Factories dependent on Canadian steel and lumber became less competitive, leading to canceled projects and job cuts. The administration touted 3% GDP growth, but economists called it a mirage, driven by pre-tariff stockpiling, not real strength. Once inventories ran out, the true cost hit home. The promise of jobs coming back was quickly replaced by pink slips and shuttered plants. The tariffs meant to protect became a self-inflicted wound. The pain spread from factories to families. Retailers like Walmart and Best Buy, squeezed by higher import costs, raised prices on everyday goods. Even coffee became pricier after Brazil was hit with new duties. The tariffs, sold as a tax on foreigners, became a tax on American households, eroding purchasing power and squeezing budgets. The auto industry was hit especially hard. With Canadian parts now expensive, assembling cars in the U.S. cost more, forcing companies to either absorb losses or pass them to consumers. Instead of a manufacturing boom, the sector faced layoffs and shrinking sales. The loss of 30,000 to 40,000 jobs in just months was a direct result of the policy. Companies reliant on North American supply chains downsized, unable to absorb the new costs. The tariffs, intended as a weapon against others, were hurting American workers most. Canada, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, chose patience over retaliation. Unlike past trade spats, Ottawa didn't launch counter-tariffs or public displays of defiance. The Carney government calculated that a tit-for-tat response would only deepen the pain for Canadian businesses and consumers. Instead, Canada focused on stability, quietly analyzing the impact and reinforcing economic defenses. Officials worked with industries to find alternative markets and adapt to the new landscape. By refusing to escalate, Canada projected calm and won international support as the reasonable actor. This strategic patience denied the Trump administration the fight it wanted, shifting the narrative away from conflict. Canada's restraint was not weakness, it was a calculated move to protect its economy and reputation. Canada's response included a bold pivot toward Mexico, exploiting a 90-day grace period Mexico received from U.S. tariffs. High-level Canadian officials rushed to Mexico City, aiming to transform a modest trade relationship into a robust alliance. Both countries saw the need to reduce dependence on unpredictable U.S. policy. The centerpiece, the Northern Corridor, a $120 billion infrastructure project to connect Canada and Mexico directly, bypassing the U.S. This vision, railways, highways, ports, would secure supply chains and open new markets. The shift wasn't just about trade, it was a long-term geopolitical realignment. Canada was turning crisis into opportunity, building a more resilient North American partnership. Despite the headlines, Canada's economy didn't collapse. The USMCA, or CUSMA, trade agreement shielded 80 to 95% of Canadian exports to the U.S. from new tariffs. Key sectors, crude oil, natural gas, and many auto parts, remained protected, insulating Canada from the worst impacts. For example, Canadian oil, making up over half of U.S. crude imports, was exempt to avoid spiking American gas prices. Even new copper tariffs targeted processed goods, not the raw forms Canada exports. The fine print of trade rules created firewalls, limiting the damage. While exports dipped 13% in Q2 2025, recovery was swift. By July, Canadian exports rose for the third straight month, with US-bound goods up 5%. The USMCA, once controversial, now proved its worth as Canada's economic buffer. This stability gave Canada breathing room to plan its next moves. The real story was one of resilience, not collapse. Suddenly, the Trump administration linked trade talks to Canada's recognition of Palestine, shifting the dispute from economics to geopolitics. What began as a fight over steel and lumber now entangled one of the world's thorniest diplomatic issues. The White House used this as a pretext to stall negotiations and justify continued tariffs, reframing Canada's stance as antagonistic. For Ottawa, this was a frustrating two-front battle, economic and diplomatic. Canada refused to make its foreign policy a bargaining chip, but the move gave Washington cover to prolong the trade war. Trust between the allies eroded, and the rules of international relations seemed up for grabs. The dispute was no longer just about trade, it was about the very nature of global diplomacy. By autumn, Canada unveiled a sophisticated two-pronged strategy. First, it lifted most of its own counter-tariffs on U.S. goods, extending an olive branch and winning support from American industries. But it kept tariffs on strategic sectors, steel, autos, lumber, signaling it wouldn't abandon its core interests. This selective de-escalation created allies within the U.S. while retaining leverage. Second, Canada doubled down on diversification, deepening ties with Mexico and advancing the Northern Corridor project. The government sought new global markets, reducing reliance on the U.S. This approach combined short-term flexibility with long-term vision. By easing some tariffs and building new trade routes, Canada protected its economy and built resilience. It was economic statecraft at its finest, smart, measured, and forward-looking. As the dust settled, Canada's calm patience proved decisive. While the U.S. suffered job losses and corporate pain, Canada's economy stabilized and began to grow. The USMCA shield and rising exports showed the strength of Canada's approach. Diversification, especially the pivot to Mexico, reduced vulnerability to U.S. political whims. The Palestine issue only reinforced the need for Canadian autonomy. The U.S. strategy, focused on short-term wins, backfired, damaging its own economy and trust with allies. Canada's quiet diplomacy and legal diligence protected its interests and enhanced its global standing. In global trade, patience and strategy outlasted bluster and brute force. Thanks for watching. Subscribe the channel for more updates.